questions out of my enduring ignorance, and I'm just hoping to educate myself. I'm addressing this particularly to Roshanak, but if anyone else knows, in the Asian tradition, there are periodic emergences of meaningless script. They're considered, spirit writing. They often speak back to the imperial structures with nonsense that only the shamanic, can understand. So I'm particularly curious about whether there's any such tradition in the calligraphic.
Not that I know of, because if you go back to the roots of calligraphy, the calligrapher is actually the hand of, it's just an instrument, and it's just producing the word of God if we go back to the tradition of calligraphy.
So just for comparison,
Sorry, can you pass
the Asian model, which I'm also, a tiny little student of, this is also the word of God, but it is indecipherable because of the corruption of the center. It must speak, the American evangelicals would call it glossolalia, right? In other words, it is a speech that only those closest to the divine can understand. You know what I'm saying? So I'm just curious as to whether there's any, given this incredibly long history, would there be anything like that? Because, of course, when you see, I was just thinking during your presentation of all the traditions of meaningless script that we find in modernism, and when Zhu Bing does this, it's very explicitly addressed to the centralized traditions of text that have been appropriated by the centralized totalitarian state. So I just wondered, is one allowed to have any such association with this? You did not present it that way, but I wondered if this, because in other words, this is the postmodern, seizure in the global frame. Oh, it's like Zhu Bing. Oh, it's like, whatever. So I just wondered, is this a completely separate reading that you don't find in the artist's own discussions of his intentionality, or would this be something he might be playing to outside of his domestic?
Are you referring to Ehsaei specifically, or
well, just just what I've learned from your
calligraphy?
presentation.
I think eventually, in Ehsaei's case, I think you can actually conclude that in a sense, because that's how he's doing it, and there are a lot of different layers of meaning making in his work that you can actually put that sense into it also. But in traditional format, I don't believe that there has been that intention, or
Great.
I don't know of it.
Right, thank you.
Can I also add something to this? There is a whole tradition of practice calligraphies, which are just practice sheets, and a lot of this comes out of that. And this originated all the way, practice sheets have been produced by calligraphers forever, but they became an art form, let's say, around the 17th century, where they're included in albums and have borders. And so those are totally letters, or combinations of letters, or repetitions of letters. And I would say there is a relationship, possibly, to those.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, it's like the Siyah Mashq case that you're referring to. They're just practices. So if I understood you right, there's no meaningful purpose. It's just the practice. So there's that difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, Caroline, there's also the work of architectural historian Richard Ettinghausen, who says that many epigraphic works in architecture are actually meaningless. But the reason why craftsmen or architects did that is because, according to Ettinghausen, these writings were placed so high, on the edges of the top of the minaret or elsewhere, that people couldn't read them anyway, so it didn't really matter.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yes, please.
My question is primarily to Talin's presentation. And I wonder if in your address of Iranian or not, do you distinguish between artists who are living and working in Iran and those who are traveling or mostly based here? I did not see an exact distinction in your presentation. There was a great range of artists, but probably Karabal Farman being on the further edge of that doubt of the question. But then I'm also thinking about those who are working in Iran, and that's also visual codes that influence the art and not only a dress of self-identification.
Thank you. In the larger work I do, I mean, it's two different chapters, those dealing with Iran and sets of issues of the artists in Iran, and their concerns are very different ones. To diasporic artists, that's Iranian, being Iranian seems to be much more sort of important for them. And so the questions of exile and return. So in the larger work I do here, I couldn't really go into definitions and just bringing out quotes. But absolutely, I mean, there is a difference in their priorities, and that transcends into their work.
Yeah, add something. It also depends on what time reference, because there is, I think 1970s, there is an interview Lili Golestan did with Marco Gregorian, and in that the same question was asked, and Marco says, I don't want to be labeled Iranian artist or Middle Eastern artist, I'm a universal artist. And this is about late 1960s, early 1970s. So I think it also depends on, as much as we don't like to maybe talk about it, it has to do with market too. If the market, so I don't want to go.
Yes, there's a question back there, and then, yes, please.
Great. This is actually, I guess, for most of you, especially Hengameh and Kelly, is both of you have directly addressed the relationship of the market to the creation of certain rubrics. And can you hear me?
No, not really.
You can't hear me. Okay, I'll move forward. I'll do screening. Okay, so both of you, thank you so much for wonderful presentations. Both of you have directly addressed the relationship of the market to the creation of certain rubrics. And as one artist friend of mine put it, sometimes these categories are necessary, in her case South Asian, in order to sell to people who want to make a prudent investment. All right, so the investment prospect attached to the rubrics, to certain rubrics. What I wonder is, so I'm tracing the arc of this particular South Asian artist's career, and I'm seeing certain patterns emerging, particularly in the auction market versus the gallery space. And I'm wondering if either of you can address a really established artist career, perhaps like Zender Ruhi or Sia Amrjani, and discuss the changing rubrics that have been attached to their name in order to make them more profitable sort of sells. Do you see larger patterns emerging?
Well, I wouldn't call it larger pattern, but I would say according to time and the politics of the time, let's say, in terms of, the dominant rhetoric of the time, a lot of these catalogs and the writings change. Also I would add, according to backgrounds in different departments and fields, I've noticed a lot of jargons change.
Okay.
So if there is a lot of focus on, let's say, anthropology, you see much more jargons from anthropology department. Then you see politics, socio-political words. I would say 1990s. You would see more, different like theories according to time.
Okay.
I think especially for Iranian art, because you have really a period of rupture in the artistic production, a very big momentum before the revolution, and then a rupture, isolation. Then you have Khatami's period that opens up, and then the Western market becomes, it seems that the Western market in the West becomes the deciding factor of these rubrics. And it's not coincidental that some of the artists in Iran said it was a liability then to be an Iranian artist. Now it's a vogue, it's something we can market on. But it also has something to do with the maturation of the Iranian diaspora, which has everything to do with patronage. You have people who want to buy Iranian art, and they have the money, and now then, as you said, they want to have Iranian art as a collection, as a clear rubric, and the auction houses that want to sell that as Iranian. The Dubai the Christie's and all these auction houses, they first wanted to go to Tehran, but they couldn't because the banking system and so it's important that they went somewhere that is close by and accessible to Iranian artists. So then after that we're seeing Iranian art now is competing with Chinese contemporary art. So absolutely, I mean, and then the artists start to market themselves as Iranian, or they undermine this. Many of them said, I don't want to be an Iranian artist. Many of them said, I want to become Iranian artist. I'm like, but you're Iranian.
But
And
many
he's like,
fall
I don't
into the
understand.
trap.
Yes,
also.
of course. No, of course. The market and art historians and critiques and museums, they create these categories, or we're all complicit in.
Thank you very much. We have just 2-3 more minutes, and I would like to take another question, please.
Roshanak, with Ehsaei's work, it's from the Western point of view, with calligraphy, any Arabic calligraphy, including Persian, the audience just looks at it. If they don't read Persian, they only understand it from the aesthetic point of view. And Ehsaei does it almost for his Persian audience in a very intellectual way. But at the end, he's almost creating the same perception for the audience. And I wonder if that is the modern, if that is the universal then for the audience, not for the artist, but for the audience. In
That's
a
true.
strange way.
Yes.
Was this ever in his writing or?
I don't think he does it intentionally, but that's what happens. If you know Persian, if you read and write Persian, you think that you can read it, but you can't.
But is it his intention to create a universal aesthetic feeling for the audience?
Yes, I think he does. Yes, very much so.
One more question.
Well, just in addition to that, I was wondering whether there's a further dimension of that, because part of modernization is a rupture with tradition, and in the sense that enacts a rupture of you think you know your identity, but you're actually alienated from it because you can no longer have the access you presume. And in a sense that connects very much with this issue of are you Iranian or not? That is, what is your access to represent or to identify? Whether you're there or not, what creates the authenticity? What's the politics
I think
of
that's
that?
the third space that he creates in his work. It's just in betweenness that you recognize or you don't recognize, and where do you stand in relationship to his work. That's why it's hard to categorize him. That's part of it, that he's being marginalized.
And perhaps one more question over there.
I just want to pick up on the question that was raised here at the beginning. When I'm coming to think about adjective, any adjective is actually a mode of operation. The moment you define yourself in a specific adjective, you create a mode of operation for the one in front of you. If I'm saying this morning I'm happy, you will approach me differently if I would say I'm very nervous and very busy today. So the adjective is actually a mode of operation. So I'm interested in these artists who are actually abolishing the adjective, because they put us actually in the question to define what is Iranian art and not them. So I wonder if there is some thought about this kind of how you move the question of identity backwards to the one in front of you by not acknowledging your identity in
Well,
working. And I wonder, I mean, from my point of view, it would be like Iranian art is not interested in what is if Iranian is or not, something like that.
Well, if I may answer part of that question, I can refer to the work of artists who are working inside Iran. And they exhibit inside Iran, so they have to work within that system. So one thing that is extremely interesting to me is how they deal with political issues, censorship, repression. And I don't just mean, oppression or censorship by the state, but also some of the cultural problems there. And what I find extremely interesting among the work of these artists, who seem to be actually unaware of it themselves, and they don't see it and they don't want to label it as Iranian, is that they're working under extremely difficult circumstances. And that's powerful. To be able to fight a system in an elegant way is really, really powerful. And that's why, I threw in the Iranian cinema in there, because I think that both Iranian artists and Iranian filmmakers actually share that identity, adjective, whatever you name it, which is working under hard circumstances. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone.